Huntersville, 53 in the Queen City. Boomer Von Cannon, WBT.
Hot. It's 5:05 and welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Tracking some statewide news this morning as we continue to await final election results in this race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Judge Jefferson Griffin, who is the Republican candidate for that contest, has renewed his legal efforts to expedite a decision on election protests that he filed regarding that 2024 Supreme Court race. Griffin currently trails Democrat Allison Riggs by about 734 votes, with a hand-eye recount scheduled to be complete a little bit later on today. Griffin has challenged over 60,000 ballots on three main grounds. The first, incomplete voter registration. The second, ballots cast by non-residents. And the third, absentee ballots without a valid photo identification. After a Wake County Superior Court denied his initial request to compel the State Board of Elections to set a new deadline for addressing his protest, Griffin is now turned to the Court of Appeals where he currently sits on the bench, seeking a compulsory order. The appeals court has requested responses to his filing by 8 o'clock this morning. Griffin and the state's Republican Party, the NCGOP, argue that the delays and a lack of clear election decision-making rules by the State Board of Elections undermine the public trust in the electoral process. Meanwhile, the state Democrat Party has filed its own lawsuit, also involving disputed ballots with a federal court. The State Board of Elections plans to discuss Griffin's challenge on Wednesday when they have one of their regularly scheduled meetings. Griffin has called for an immediate resolution to allow for potential judicial review and certification of the election winner, which is still withstanding now more than 1 full month after the November general election. Again, those in this Court of Appeals case, their responses are due by 8 o'clock this morning. If there's anything newsworthy that comes throughout the day today, we'll, of course, pass it along to you on the Carolina Journal News Hour and have details over at carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:07, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. It's been months now since Hurricane Helene ravaged portions of western North Carolina, and even still, that story is getting huge national attention with a big visit from J.D. Vance, the vice presidential president-elect. To get some more details on that, Teresa Opeka, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. Teresa, it's sad out often after these natural disasters and events. There's a lot of talk for a period of time, and then it just falls off the wayside. But this situation out in western North Carolina seems very different than maybe some other events that we see across the nation.
Yeah, good morning, Nick. Usually things hit a news cycle and they're gone. They're here 1 minute, gone the next. Thankfully not with western North Carolina. As you mentioned, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance was in Fairview and Buncombe County on Friday, along with U.S. Senators Thom Tillis and Ted Budd, and members from Samaritan's Purse. They were touring the damage of western North Carolina, also seeing what organizations like Samaritan's Purse was working on. They're helping restore somebody's house. As you know, J.D. Vance mentioned, the government's a little behind in helping out people, so a lot of the private organizations, nonprofits, have to step up and help the people out there, because it's just it's overwhelming to see the damage, and it's going to take years to repair all of this.
Well, and you look at what's going to happen here over the next couple of weeks. The Trump administration and all of their cabinet picks, and everybody's going to be getting into their positions of power up in Washington, D.C. And we've heard from the former president, and assume, Teresa, we've heard from Vance that western North Carolina will not be forgotten, which is one of the things that Trump said continually over the last about 2 months since that storm took place. And there's been a lot of criticism, and I think rightfully so, at the federal government, FEMA, and their response to this natural disaster.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We saw the hearings with Deanne Criswell, the FEMA administrator, saying, there was actually talk at one point about in Florida and even western North Carolina to avoid people's homes who were damaged in Helene, who had Trump Vance yard signs, political signs on them. She said, no, that was a one-off, so that was brought to light. But there's been there's been some back and forth about maybe some emergency shelters staying put in some areas in Western North Carolina, not being delivered to people who truly need them. Yeah, so this light has definitely been shed on that, and that's where J.D. Vance came before Christmas. He said, "I want to let all you guys know out there, you're not forgotten. We're thinking about you. We're trying to help you. We're going to help as soon as the transition takes over in January, just to let people know." But it's got to be so sad and so gut wrenching. Some people are still living in tents at this point for how cold, how much snow they've gotten. Yeah, the light needs to keep shining on this. Absolutely.
Teresa, you've been following the political game a long time. Is there actually, do you think, in your estimation, you follow this stuff day in and day out, do you think we'll actually see a substantial difference in that recovery, in that relief, when this new administration is sworn in the later parts of January? Or unfortunately, like everything else, is this a political story that might be good for the headlines, but at the grand scheme of things, we're talking about a big, bloated, bureaucratical federal government, and things, unfortunately, just kind of chug along very, very slowly?
Yeah, I think you could divide the story into two sections, federal versus state. I think for the Trump administration, I mean, he's full steam ahead before he has even taken office. There's so many things. Actually, I saw a story yesterday about President Biden's staff saying, you're just letting Trump take over. How dare you? You're not completing your term. So that's how much of he's putting the pedal to the metal and getting going before he even gets into office. I think there's going to be some big shakeups, and you're seeing that with who Trump's picking for his cabinet. So I'm hoping that it's going to move along a lot faster than it is now. Traditionally, how the federal government has always lagged, as you will. As far as state response, you've seen what happened with NCORE. There's people still who lost their homes to Hurricanes Matthew and Florence almost a decade later who still don't have homes. NCORE has been mismanaged. And now we're going to have a new governor coming in, Governor-elect Josh Stein, who's Attorney General. Is it going to follow in the same vein as Roy Cooper? The last how many years, time will tell. But, I covered all of those hearings in the last few years where the government ops was taking over. And it's just like wash, rinse, repeat. I have a feeling it's going to almost go the same way. You can't predict anything, but I really think the federal government's going to step up under Trump. That's just a feeling I have.
And I think that's exactly what the folks out in not even just Western North Carolina, Teresa, you can imagine even across the country. You go to the eastern half of the state right on the Atlantic Ocean, and I would assume even nationwide, all the states on the eastern seaboard, the Gulf Coast, into portions of Texas, seeing what the Trump administration does and how they handle this, what many would call botched relief out in portions of Western North Carolina. We've heard a lot from our two U.S. senators over the last couple of weeks about this. Senators Ted Budd and Thom Tillis, they've been beating the drum in D.C. about additional funding. Has there been any movement on that in the last couple of days, or are things still kind of chugging along in the lame duck session up in the House and Senate up in D.C.?
Yeah, so I haven't heard too much about that. As you're talking about that, I was looking for something. So nothing on the Tillis Budd front. I'm sure they are trying to get some movement going on with that. But there is going to be today up in D.C., a delegation of North Carolina House members, including House Speaker Tim Moore, also Congressman-elect Tim Moore, along with Representative Destin Hall and Representative Dudley Green. They're going to be up there. They're going to travel to Capitol Hill to urge Congress, federal, and FEMA to take swift and decisive action to aid the victims of Hurricane Helene. That is supposed to take place tomorrow, so expect to see a report on that. So they're being more vocal as well. Like I said, keep shining the light, keeping vocal about this, because the damage and unfortunately, it's just not going to go away anytime soon, and people really, truly need this help.
No question about it. You can read more on Teresa's story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's 5:14, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for a look at traffic on this Tuesday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And first of all,
It's 521. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are streaming live this morning as well on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel, where you can check us out live there. If you do miss any portion of the show this morning, hey, check out the podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour or visit WBT.com and hover over the podcast tab. Well, last night, approximately 300 protesters assembled at the state capitol to voice their opposition to Senate Bill 382. This is a piece of legislation that will provide over $200 million in financial relief for Western North Carolina. However, the bill also includes and changes some of the authority for incoming Democrat Governor Josh Stein. Chants from the crowd emphasized that their desire for aid that doesn't diminish the power of elected leaders. The bill, sponsored by Republican lawmakers, seeks to address severe infrastructure damage out in Western North Carolina while also making some of these changes to appointments. House Speaker Tim Moore defended the measure and highlighted the state's efforts and a push for federal aid. However, as you can imagine, many protesters in the crowd remain unconvinced of that and are now demanding a solution that supports recovery without compromising what they call as the democratic governance that we have here in North Carolina. The General Assembly, the House, will be back in session tomorrow on Wednesday to go forward with an override of Senate Bill 382. We'll track those details and pass them along to you right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:23. There is a town called Carrboro right outside of Chapel Hill, and they are making some news this morning as they are suing Duke Energy. They are the largest electrical producer and provider here in the state of North Carolina. To get some more details on that, it's my pleasure to welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning the editor-in-chief of CarolinaJournal.com, Donna King. Donna, this town, it's not small. It's about 22,000 people, but they're going after the behemoth in Duke Energy. What are the details on that you're tracking this morning?
Yeah, of course. Good morning. This is coming from the Town Council of Carrboro, North Carolina. It's in Orange County, just outside of Chapel Hill. This town council has filed a lawsuit against Duke Energy for what they describe as they want damages for climate-related harm, saying they're alleging that the utility misled the public about the dangers of fossil fuel emissions and how fast they would switch to renewables and that kind of thing. There's a couple of things about this. One, there have been other lawsuits like this from climate activist groups in other states. This is the first time that an actual municipality, as opposed to a group of activists, have filed a lawsuit. And it's also against a big utility. So there's a couple of different layers to this, which make it pretty interesting. One being a municipality. This is funded by a group called NC Warn. Now, NC Warn is a nonprofit group that is working on goals that include things like accelerating the transition to clean power and to try to really pump up the press coverage of the what they say the crisis of climate change. So this lawsuit is one of them. And what that's meant, though, that critics are saying this is just all political theater to make a point, and they're using the court system to do it.
Well, I guess it would be a valid question to ask if you're suing somebody and claiming damages. Do they have any specific examples of what specifically Duke Energy has done to hurt this town of about 22,000 people right outside Chapel Hill?
Well, one of the things they're pointing to, which I think is interesting, is they're pointing to Hurricane Helene as being evidence of the damage of climate change, and that Duke Energy is participating in a misinformation campaign about the risk of climate change. So, we've had our own policy analyst and environmental expert here at the John Locke Foundation talk about that. And really even the Obama administration, folks that have worked there have said that attempt to link hurricanes to climate change is not really grounded in science. And even one of them called it, dishonest. So, some of the basics of what this lawsuit is predicated on are being debated within the scientific community. But I also think that it is getting what they wanted. It's getting that publicity to their issues. But groups like the Consumer Choice Center, they're saying that what this really does is it undermines the progress that North Carolina, the very real progress that North Carolina has made toward reducing emissions.
Well, let me ask you just that. Duke has been in the news for the last couple of decades, it seems, at this point, Donna, as they've converted a vast majority of their coal plants to steam plants. They are on carbon reduction goals, depending on what program you look at, 2030, 2050, as they kind of come alongside a lot of the things that the Cooper administration wanted to do in regards to reducing emissions and things like that. It seems rather interesting that they've been leading this clean energy transition, if you'll call it that, and now they're being sued, I guess, for not doing it quick enough.
That's what they're saying. They're saying that they weren't moving down the timeline that they wanted, and but it is important. You're right. This whole transition to clean energy has been a big focus of the Cooper administration, and really, if you look at just back to 2020 to 2005, just over the last 20 years, North Carolina has reduced its carbon output by 52%. This is the emissions from electricity have declined 52% over the last 20 years. And you really have to look at that. The Energy Institute also says if you compare that to, say, like China, they're increasing all the time. The rest of the world is increasing. So this focus on North Carolina specifically in this lawsuit may have difficulty getting traction.
That was going to be my next question for you. Yeah. What exactly does something like this look like, Dono? How do we go forward? Again, you're talking about a relatively small township going after a major electrical producer and provider that's not just in North Carolina. They're, up from Ohio all the way down to the Florida coast. What does the next step for something like this look like? Is this a state, a federal issue? Where does this go?
Well, they filed it in Orange County, in Superior Court of Orange County, so that's where it would be heard there. But the head of NC Warren, who's funding and who's doing this lawsuit and supporting this lawsuit, says that this is sort of like what the tobacco companies did. That's the connection that they're trying to draw. The Duke Energy is like the tobacco companies in that they're misleading the public about the risks of climate change. I think that they're going to have a hard time doing that, but we'll see, because there have been these lawsuits in other places. In Honolulu, in a lawsuit that's only similar, it's a little bit different in that it's not filed by a municipality, the state of Honolulu settled that lawsuit. So I would be surprised if Duke Energy took that tactic, but I do think that this should be interesting to watch, because it's a trend of starting to look at lawfare as a way to make your political point.
You think if something like this escalated to more of the federal level, and we saw maybe more states, more municipalities, even maybe counties and cities, much smaller geographical areas, going after these major electrical and utility providers across the country, that we'd maybe see some conversation or some comments coming in from the federal government in regards to this, that we're expecting a big shakeup here come early parts of next month?
Sure. Oh, there's going to be big changes. But if you look at, there was a lawsuit similar to this filed in San Francisco. And one thing that came out of that is that the Ninth Circuit Court actually said that the lawsuit needed to be dismissed. And a group there asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case instead, even though the Ninth Circuit, which, they're not by any stretch of the imagination going to be right-leaning, they said that this lawsuit needed to be dismissed there. So the plaintiffs in that suit asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take it up, and they have not responded. So I would anticipate that this is really going to generate press and discussion and truthfully spend a lot of left-leaning money when now that the election is over, they've got a place to put it.
Very interesting information this morning. You can read more details on our story by visiting carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Have a
and for you.
Huh? It's 5:37. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are tracking additional details this morning with relief out in western North Carolina. On Friday, it was Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. He was in Fairview, North Carolina. That's over in Buncombe County. The city of Asheville is the largest area there in Buncombe County. And he delivered a message to the people of western North Carolina who continue to deal with the devastation left by Hurricane Helene, that they have not been forgotten. He told the group, quote, "We love you. We want you to have the best Christmas that you can possibly have despite the circumstances." He was alongside Senators Ted Budd and Tom Tillis, both of them representing us here in North Carolina. Vance and his wife, as well as the Samaritan's Purse COO and Edward Graham, Will Graham, and the Executive Vice President of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, Casey Graham Lynch. Vance said that it was important to visit the area before the Christmas season. Among his stops, Vance visited the Fairview Volunteer Fire Department to meet with the family members of Battalion Chief Tony Garrison, who lost his life back on September the 27th while attempting a landslide rescue during the storm. Helene also flooded the fire department. Vance said, "One of our biggest complaints that I am hearing today is that insurance companies who should be doing their job and should be doing right by these people are not actually stepping up and not giving people what was promised. When you have big gaps left by these companies, unfortunately, a lot of private citizens have to step in and fill those gaps, and that's exactly what Samaritan's Purse is doing," end quote. Vance also toured the home of the Wright family, which of the Boone-based evangelical group Samaritan's Purse was helping rebuild their house. Samaritan's Purse went into action immediately after the storm in not only western North Carolina, but also portions of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee, where Helene also left some catastrophic damage. That organization was literally the first on the ground, providing water, food, generators, fuel, as well as Starlink systems through military aircraft to try and get people relief in those very pivotal couple of days after Helene. They have also volunteered cutting trees, moving debris, tarping roof, as well as mudding out homes, which involves cutting drywall, removing insulation, as well as spraying mold technology called Shockwave, which kills that mold. According to a press release on its website, Samaritan's Purse has 5 relief bases, 3 in North Carolina, plus 1 in Georgia and Florida, and has assisted more than 4,800 homeowners. They will be replacing hundreds of manufactured homes, as well as repairing and rebuilding stick-built homes over the coming years. Vance told reporters that the incoming Trump-Vance administration will be focused on improving communications, infrastructure, and particularly that during emergency situations. Quote, "We need to make sure that our communications infrastructure is in place, that if God forbid another area like this is affected by the storm, at least we have the communication in place to minimize the damage and to allow people to communicate with the people they love." End quote. So, as we talked about it a little bit earlier this morning with Teresa Opeka, who has this story this morning over at CarolinaJournal.com, there's going to be a lot of emphasis, it appears to be the case, a lot of emphasis on western North Carolina once the Trump-Vance administration takes over. Of course, we've seen a lot of the appointments as well as the various transition team members and cabinet picks coming out of the Trump admin, and we'll see exactly how all of that is going to shake out over the next couple of weeks. And can some of these folks get that federal relief that they need, that they desperately have been asking for months? Well, that remains to be seen. We'll continue to track those details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. The Town Council of Carrboro, which is a small town just outside of Chapel Hill, has filed a lawsuit against Duke Energy. They're doing that in the Orange County Superior Court. They've accused the utility of misleading the public about fossil fuel emissions and delaying renewable energy adoption. The lawsuit, supported and funded in part by NC Ward, the suit seeks damages for climate-related harms, citing Hurricane Helene as an example of climate change impacts. Scarborough Mayor Barbara Forshee emphasized the need to address the climate crisis and hold Duke Energy accountable for its environmental injustice. That's what they claim. Critics, including the John Locke Foundation as well as the Consumer Choice Center, have dismissed the lawsuit as political theater. The deputy director of the Consumer Choice Center, Yael Asowski, said, quote, litigation like this is less about meaningful environmental progress and more about scoring political points at the expense of energy customers, end quote. They argue that North Carolina has already made significant progress in reducing carbon emissions with a 52% decline since 2005, as well as they claim that the lawsuit undermines this progress while ignoring global emissions trends, particularly in places like China. Duke Energy, just for the record, provides nearly 90% of North Carolina's electricity and is being accused by NC Warren of suppressing renewable energy and expanding fossil fuels despite the global climate crisis. Opponents argue that the lawsuit favors the solar industry over nuclear, which comprises a significant portion of North Carolina's energy mix. The case marks the first lawsuit filed by a municipality against an energy utility, adding to the growing number of climate lawsuits across the United States, despite previous legal setbacks in similar cases. And as we talked about with Donna King a little bit earlier this morning, Duke Energy has done a lot over the last 2 decades, 20 years or so, in regards to clean energy. They have converted a vast majority of their coal plants over to steam plants. So instead of burning coal, they're burning natural gas and converting that to steam, turning turbines and providing electricity. They have truly done a lot, and yet the town council in Scarborough, including the mayor, claims that they are not doing enough to address climate change. I'll note Scarborough has just 22,000 residents in it, and they are suing Duke Energy over climate change. I'll let you chew on that one. Right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, 544 News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. It is time to get another look at traffic. Some foggy roadways on a Tuesday morning. Let's get the latest with Boomer Von Cannon.
You got it, Nick. Yes, sir.
846 done. Hot.
It's 5:51. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Tuesday morning to you. In continuing tracking some statewide news, Judge Jefferson Griffin, who is the Republican candidate for the state Supreme Court, has renewed his legal efforts to expedite a decision on election protests that he filed regarding the Supreme Court race that took place about a month ago. Griffin currently trails Democrat Allison Riggs by 734 votes. The hand-eye recount that we talked about last week is scheduled to be completed a little bit later on today. Griffin has challenged over 60,000 ballots on three main grounds. The first, incomplete voter registration. The second, ballots cast by non-residents. And the third, absentee ballots that were cast without a valid photo ID. After a Wake County Superior Court denied his initial request to compel the State Board of Elections to set a deadline for addressing the protest, Griffin has now turned to the North Carolina Court of Appeals, of where he currently sits, seeking a compulsory order. The appeals court has requested responses to his filing by 8 o'clock this morning. Griffin and the state Republican Party argue that the delays in this, as well as a lack of clear election decision rulemaking by the North Carolina State Board of Elections, undermined public trust in the electoral process. Meanwhile, the state's Democrat Party has filed its own lawsuit, and it also involves ballots disputes. That is slated to head to federal court. The State Board of Elections does plan to discuss Griffin's challenge on Wednesday. They've got a board meeting then. Griffin has called for an immediate resolution to allow potential judicial review as well as a certification of the election winner. The Democrat and Allison Riggs has already claimed victory publicly, and now she has turned her attention to chastising Judge Jefferson Griffin as well as the North Carolina Republican Party for their continued lawfare in this. This is likely to go on for a couple more weeks. We'll continue to track the details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Last night, approximately 300 protesters assembled at the state capitol to voice their opposition to Senate Bill 382. That's a piece of legislation which will provide an additional $200 million in financial relief to Western North Carolina, bringing the state's total very close to $1 billion worth of relief. Demonstrators argued that the bill undermines the authority of newly elected Democrat Governor Josh Stein while addressing regional recovery needs. Chants from the crowd resonated across the Capitol grounds, and with them emphasizing their desire for aid that does not diminish the power of elected leaders. However, the bill, sponsored by Republican lawmakers, seeks to address severe infrastructure damage in the region. House Speaker Tim Moore defended the measure, highlighting the state's efforts as well as a push for federal relief. However, many protesters, many of them falling on the Democrat side of the aisle, remain unconvinced and are demanding a solution on relief that does not compromise what they call democratic governance, claiming that the Republican GA is going for a political power grab in their waning days of the North Carolina General Assembly session, in which they have a supermajority. We've seen over 25 veto overrides in the General Assembly session. We will see potentially the final coming up for you tomorrow. The House is the next place for this. If the House is able to successfully override the governor's veto of Senate Bill 382, it will in fact become law. They will be at the GA tomorrow. We'll be tracking that throughout the week right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance was in Fairview, North Carolina on Friday as he was there to offer support to Western North Carolinians that were devastated by Hurricane Helene. Joined by North Carolina Republican Senators Ted Budd and Tom Tillis, as well as representatives from Samaritan's Purse and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, Vance emphasized the region had not been forgotten and pledged efforts to bring federal relief there before Christmas. At the Fairview Volunteer Fire Department, Vance honored Battalion Chief Tony Garrison, who died during a rescue attempt doing his job, and acknowledged residents' frustrations with unresponsive insurance companies as well as the federal government. He spent some time highlighting the work of Samaritan's Purse. Vance toured a local rebuilding effort, including the Wright family's home, as well as commended the organization's comprehensive disaster recovery, which spans several states. They've got operations here in North Carolina as well as Georgia and Florida. Vance also announced plans for the incoming Trump-Vance administration to prioritize improvements to emergency communication infrastructure, aiming to better manage future disasters and safeguard affected communities. With that, there is still a lot of attention on this in Washington, D.C. We've heard from Ted Budd and Tom Tillis, both of our senators here in North Carolina, about continued relief from the federal level. We currently do sit in this lame duck congressional session, however, so we're not exactly sure if there's going to be any movement on that in Joe Biden's final weeks in the Oval Office. But that, of course, is something that we continue to track here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. That's going to do it for a Tuesday edition. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.